Hello, Nick Leifker again, and welcome to GMGT 590 Operations Management. We started by talking about some of the people in the industry who handled their supply chains well. So now we've come to a second example, Amazon.com. Amazon.com is, for lack of a better way of putting it, the business equivalent of a long-distance runner. Very lean, very efficient, and very little fat, very little inventory. You see, Amazon in 2009 earned about $24.5 billion in revenue, and with a net income of over $900 million. And yet they have almost no inventory. They only stock a few hundred best-selling book titles. After all, Amazon did get its start as a bookstore once upon a time. So what do they do? How do they do it? Well, what Amazon does is, if need be, they can quickly order up to 20,000 other book titles that are available. However, what's interesting with Amazon is what they do with non-book items. You see, what they do with non-book items is a nice little thing called drop shipping. Now, drop shipping is a nice little tool that takes advantage of some things with regard to Amazon's position within the market. Generally, how drop shipping works is this. We go online and we decide to buy something. Suppose we decide to buy a hat. Well, we go on Amazon, we select the hat we want, we click the hat, we check out, we put in our payment information, and that payment information, as well as the money, goes to Amazon.com. Amazon accepts the order, accepts the payment, accepts the money. It then orders that same hat from the dropshipper, from the warehouse. And that dropshipper then puts it in a box with an Amazon logo on it. Amazon supplies the boxes for them. It prints out the receipt with Amazon letterhead on it. Amazon supplies the paper for the receipts. And the hat is put in the box. The hat is shipped to the customer. The customer receives the hat receives a box with a nice little Amazon logo on it, receives the hat inside, and the customer is happy. Well, in reality, all people in this area are happy. You see, the customer's happy because they get their hat, they get what they ordered. The Amazon's happy because they get money. Life is always good that way. And the dropshipper's happy because they got an order. They actually made a sale. Now, here's something to think about. Suppose you're the company that's selling the hat, that actually made the hat or bought it wholesale or whatever, and sells hats for a living. Why wouldn't you put it on your own website? Wouldn't you put your hat on your own website? Well, chances are you do. However, here's the thing. If you're your average customer and you have the choice between shopping at some random hat website and Amazon.com, which are you going to choose? Well, most people, unless they're really into hats, would choose Amazon.com. And that is what makes dropshipping work. This idea that Amazon, by supplying the website, by supplying the face, if you will, of the commercial transaction, they get their cut. So, we've looked at companies that did it well. What about companies that don't do it well? What happens? Well, here's some examples. Boeing Aircraft. They had to write down $2.6 billion in October 1997 because of raw material shortages. IBM, 1993, lost a major fraction of the sales of desktop computers because they couldn't get enough chips that can control computer displays. Nintendo, It may seem like, the Nintendo Wii was launched in 2007, and 7 years ago, I realize. But 7 years ago, the Wii was a big thing. And because Nintendo couldn't supply the Wiis fast enough, they lost sales of about $1 billion during the holiday season. Kmart, well, we've talked about what happened in that industry and what happened there. And essentially, Walmart innovated, Kmart did not. Walmart has survived and thrived. Kmart has not thrived, and there's some question as to whether it will survive. You see, there are certain statements that companies never, ever, ever want to make to the public. Probably the worst possible statement you can make to the public is that you're a fraud in some form or another. But the second worst is that you can't get business done. And when you have a supply chain issue, you are telling the world you can't get business done. So, when you tell the world you can't get business done, what does that do to your stock price? Well, it drops by about 8.5% that day. So, just by making that statement that day, what people value your company at drops by about 8.5%. And over the course of the next 6 months, it can drop by as much as 20%. Yeah. If you tell the world you can't do business, pretty much the world will agree with you. So, if a supply chain disruption is this damaging to a business, what can we do? Well, the first thing that we need to understand is that this is not your typical variation. Most people, when they think of variation, think good old normal curve, mean standard deviation. Life is good. Well, this is one of those cases where the normal curve doesn't fit. Here we may have a 99% probability of life being awesome and life being spiffy, and a 1% probability of everything just going south, So, when you have something like this, where you have these shocks, what do you do? How do you handle it? Well, what you do is you make plans. You can't predict when it's going to happen. When can you predict when the next earthquake is going to hit California, for instance? But you make plans. What happens if an earthquake hits California? That you can do. And that, if your company does business in California, you should do. So, what can cause a supply chain disruption? Well, lots of things. First, extreme weather. Think about what happens when a hurricane hits New York. Think about what happens when blizzards hit Rochester. They affect how people do business. Natural disasters, fires, earthquakes. Good way of thinking about this. There are no records for Levi Strauss & Company before 1906. There is a very good reason for this. All of their records were destroyed in the Great San Francisco earthquake and fire. So, before 1906, when it comes to the history of blue jeans, well, things are somewhat of a guess. Strikes. Well, in this case, again, it's not just you, but it's your suppliers that you have to worry about. If your suppliers go on strike, if your suppliers have their workers go on strike, all of a sudden, you may find yourself in a difficult situation with regard to getting raw materials. Terrorism. This is 21st century. This is something that we have to worry about. And then probably the most common is this failed businesses and failed partnerships. If businesses fail, all of a sudden they're not supplying to us. Really good example of this. When Enron imploded, of course Enron supplied energy to a large number of companies. Now, fortunately, in a lot of cases, Enron had already bought the energy that it was supplying to its retail customers. However, all of those customers once that contract ended, had to find new suppliers. So when businesses fail, you oftentimes have to, the businesses that bought from those companies oftentimes have to find new suppliers. Again, these are things that we can rarely predict. Terrorist acts are by design unpredictable. Extreme weather is notoriously unpredictable. Natural disasters, also unpredictable. However, there are areas that we know are targets for terrorism. There are areas where certain natural disasters are likely to occur. There are certain areas where extreme weather is likely to occur. So, we may not be able to predict them, but we know we have to plan for them. Now, there is one saving grace in all this, and that is that demand uncertainty is a lot like supply uncertainty. You see, what we're most concerned about is the difference between demand and supply. Having too much demand is a lot like having too little supply. You're primarily concerned about the difference between those two. As a result, there's similar strategies for dealing with it. Having inventory, having safety stock. Again, inventory you have to be careful of because you don't want too much. But inventory is not necessarily a bad thing. Multiple sources. By having multiple different sources, this allows us to take into account the possibility that one of those sources can possibly end up going out of business or going on fire. Also, if we have improved forecasting, if we have a better idea as to what's going to happen, we can better make plans for what is likely to happen. So, we have strategies, we have tools that are available under demand uncertainty that we can apply to supply uncertainty. So usually those same strategies hold, but not always. Sometimes the conventional wisdom does not hold. You see, place matters. Where something is matters. As a result, where we, for lack of a better way of putting it, expose our inventory to risk. This is important. This can affect how we do business. As a result, with several examples, with several things that go on, the conventional wisdom that we hold for demand uncertainty does not hold for supply uncertainty. The first, something that we studied last week, risk pooling. In general, we want to pool inventory in one location so that we have less safety stock, or we need less safety stock to meet a certain service level. So, if we have demand uncertainty, by having these consolidated locations, by consolidating all our inventory in one place, we need less safety stock. So, smaller inventory is required. The problem is, this is that good old saying about putting all our eggs in one basket. If we put all our eggs in one basket, we better make sure that the basket stays safe. So if there is supply uncertainty, it may be a good idea to have our inventory in several different locations. Yes, it may mean inventory is higher, higher safety stock across our business, but that may be the cost of dealing with this supply uncertainty. Of course, there are ways of having your cake and eating it too here. For instance, why not have virtual pooling, where if locations can share inventory as needed, if one's running low, they can do that. So there are ways of having your cake and eating it too here. The next area where the problems with supply uncertainty don't necessarily match those of demand uncertainty is inventory placement. Where do we hold the inventory? Do we hold it downstream or upstream? Well, how much does it cost to hold inventory? In general, it costs less to hold inventory early on in the supply chain at the raw materials, because what these processes always do is they take stuff and they make it into more valuable stuff. The problem is, if there's a disruption somewhere in the supply chain, if you have all your inventory early on in the supply chain at the raw material stage, suddenly that supply chain could be cut off from its inventory and could be starved. Now, the second thing that we're going to talk about, in order to understand it, well, we need to think about what supply chain is, what happens over the course of a supply chain. Remember, with supply chains, we start with dirt, we start with raw materials, and we go through several companies, several processes, to eventually get a finished good, a finished product that the customer wants to buy. So, here's the question for you. Where is inventory cheapest? Where is inventory most expensive? Well, remember what processes do. They take stuff and they convert it into more valuable stuff. So, if we want to save costs on inventory, we'll have most of our stuff at the beginning of the supply chain, where it's still dirt, where it's still cheaper. After all, dirt is cheaper than an iPhone. Usually, anyway. The problem with this, of course, is what happens if there's a disruption later on in your supply chain? Well, all of your inventory is early on in the supply chain at the raw materials. So suddenly you can't access the inventory in your supply chain. Your supply chain is starved and it shuts down. So, how do we guard against this? Well, you guard against it by having at least some inventory later on in the supply chain. Yeah, it's more expensive to have the inventory later on in the supply chain, but it guards against the possibility of supply chain disruption. So if there's a temporary disruption, we have some finished goods on hand that we can sell. Now, the third area where supply chain uncertainty and demand uncertainty tend to go at loggerheads is with lean supply chain management. Remember what lean does. It tries to get as much of the inventory out of the process as possible. So by doing this, by removing almost all the inventory from the supply chain, well, if all of a sudden our supply becomes uncertain, all of a sudden our supply dries up, our supply chain, our operations, our process will have to shut down and will be starved fairly quickly. So when we have disruptions like this, oftentimes firms are scrambling to find new suppliers just to keep their businesses running, keep their businesses going. So it's always a good idea in cases like this to have plans, to know what you're going to do if a supplier suddenly finds itself unable to supply your business. So, in conclusion, with regard to disruptions to the supply chain, first thing, always assess the likelihood of these disruptions. Always assess the possibility of these disruptions. Is it hurricane season? Is it tornado season? What's the likelihood that a blizzard is going to hit town? In these high-risk situations, in these high-risk periods, you hold more inventory. Now, one company that has gotten very good at figuring out what demand is going to be in disaster situations is, oddly enough, Walmart. After all, what usually happens when a disaster is looming, when you have, say, a hurricane coming, people buy stuff. People buy stuff in certain patterns. And one of the things that Walmart's noticed with regard to those patterns is some of the things that people buy. One of the most popular items in a disastrous situation, strawberry Pop-Tarts. Because they're food, they require no refrigeration, they require no cooking, and some people apparently find them tasty. Anyway, one last thing, have plans, make plans. I believe it was Dwight Eisenhower who said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. So, make these plans so that you have some blueprint as to what you're going to do when these disruptions occur. In the next video, we're going to talk about some of the challenges that modern supply chains face and how they're being addressed. Thank you.